Hey kids, it is episode 291 of the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast. Very excited because coming back to the show one last time is Tierne Steele, who is an excellent podcaster and author and one of the people who I've just grown so fond of during the run of this show. And I was glad we could get her one last time. And we had sort of a subject to talk about. It went off in about 1,000 different directions, but I really enjoyed the conversation, as I always do with Tierney. Anywho, I know this sounds like one of my mini episodes, and I am recording it like a mini episode. And over the last few weeks, I've been doing these recordings in my car because, quite frankly, I got a lot of kids running around my house and a lot of craziness, and often driving to and fro at the time when I'm able to do some recording. And I am recording this on Sunday, Sunday, October 29th, the day after it was revealed that Matthew Perry died of an apparent heart attack and drowning. He was, and I don't think everything is completely known, but from what I am been made to understand, he was in his hot tub, he had a heart attack, and apparently drowned as a result. That it could end up being a little more involved or complicated, and it doesn't. I hate to say it doesn't matter how he passed, but that is not the most important thing in the grand scheme of things. What is important is Matthew Perry was an iconic performer in the role of Chandler Bing in the TV show Friends. And I remember Friends came out when I was in college, and it was such delightful wish fulfillment. And it wasn't the best written show. It wasn't Frasier, which is getting a reboot right now. And Frasier was always a very smart program. It wasn't. It's while people still watch Friends, it hasn't aged the best. It had a very whitewashed version of New York City. Also, they relied a little too heavily on gay panic jokes. But it was very well cast. And was able to make some true stars. Jennifer Aniston is still a viable TV star. She had some success with movies, and never quite reached A-list, but her name attached to a TV miniseries or TV series gets that show made. Lisa Kudrow has done some good work. She's become more of a character actor. Courtney Cox went from Friends, tried another TV drama that didn't quite catch on, had some success in movies with the Scream franchise, and then was in Cougar Town, which I thought was a really good show, and also was sort of a show that avoided some of the problems that Friends had. David Schwimmer did some movie work and pops up doing well-respected roles in TV. Matt LeBlanc had another, what was it, Man of the House or something along those lines. A show that I didn't watch, but had success. And then he was also in another HBO or Showtime, a pay cable series where he was playing a version of himself that got good buzz. So they all had a lot of success. Matthew Perry you could see how badly they wanted him to do the same, for him to have that success. He had quite a few TV shows. Go On and The Odd Couple, all of which were good. He was still sort of playing Chandler. He was very good on a handful of episodes of The Good Wife, and then The Good Wife spinoff, The Good Fight, where a little bit more of a dramatic take, while still not being a super serious character, but playing like a bad guy, playing a weasel, and he did that really well. Matthew Perry was in the news a lot recently between Friends having an anniversary episode and him having an autobiography that came out. I mumbled that, sorry. That autobiography got a lot of press because he talked very openly about his substance abuse issues. Matthew Perry was in a world where he was a very funny guy in an industry with great-looking people. And he was a good-looking fella. Like, if he was in your office, he'd be the cute guy in the office. But in a world where he's competing against, a young Ray Fiennes for role, or a Dylan McDermott, or Dermot Mulroney, and I know that's a joke, but I don't know which one is which. And he is dating ridiculously beautiful women. He apparently, his insecurities led to a very quick end to a blossoming relationship he had with Julia Roberts. And this is Julia Roberts, where she was the most charismatic, beautiful, A-list woman on the planet. But he was, it's funny, like in real world, Matthew Perry, good-looking guy, a world-class athlete. He was an excellent tennis player. I think he was like a world-ranked junior youth tennis player. So it was funny where he was the wimpy, unathletic guy on Friends, and he was easily the best athlete on that show. And I think it really could strike people, and we all have had that, where we have a friend or relative or someone in our circle who is the really good looking to the point where everyone thinks he's funny, charming, or whatever, and it's like, no, he's just really handsome, or she's just got an amazing figure, or he's got great biceps, and it can be a difficult thing to compete with if you're just a mere mortal. And I think that's why we all gravitated towards Matthew Perry, aside from the fact that he had amazing comedic timing, had a very effortless charm. I think we all wanted to we all wanted to protect Chandler. I've said to friends where I lost interest in Friends halfway through the run of the show, which isn't uncommon. The show was on for a very long time. You don't love every show forever. One of the things that tempered my enjoyment of the show was just how mean Phoebe, the character Phoebe, became towards Chandler. And it was just a weird thing where Phoebe was supposed to be nice and kind of ditzy, and she just would be really rude to Chandler. And I wanted to protect Chandler because I saw myself in him. The guy can be kind of quippy and sardonic and sarcastic, and I saw myself in him. And it's heartbreaking. He passed, I think it was the age of 54. You hoped, there was hope that he would defeat his substance abuse issues, which it sounds like he was doing well with, and would be able to sort of get back in fighting shape. And the comedic possibilities were endless. And I also think the dramatic possibilities were also really impressive. Somebody with his timing, his likability, his charm, but then also, and he brought this to his comedic performances, and sometimes the greatest dramatic actors are comedic personalities where there's an underlying pathos or pain to their performance, like Robin Williams, who did Oscar-winning work as a dramatic actor, like Jim Carrey, who Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind was just a brilliant performance from Jim Carrey, where he just reined in his wacky shtick, and you got to see the pain that was always behind his performances. And I think we will miss that from Matthew Perry. I don't know if it was going to happen. He hadn't been working a lot in recent years, but there was so much more depths to be explored with him as a performer. And this is a sad one. This is one that sort of hits sort of deep for people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. I know because the show has maintained a lot of popularity and new generations keep finding it, but I think people my age wanted our life to be like Friends. We wanted to have those, rooming with our best friends and across the hall from our other best friends, and being able to just walk into each other's rooms and, just hang out. I remember there was just a neat moment where, it was such a minor moment, where Joey or Ross walks into Chandler and Joey's apartment. Chandler's sitting on the couch and Monica is sitting on his lap, and this is before the characters were involved, but they were just casually snuggled up on a chair. And I remember those moments in college especially, where even if you're not somebody that you're romantically paired with, your dorm room would have like maybe an uncomfortable chair or two, and then the double beds, and you would just hop on the bed and snuggle up with your friend of frequent contributor to the show, Amy Kennerup. I remember there was a couple times where we'd be hanging out, and and she would just rest her head on my shoulder while we were talking on the bed, and it was just such a innocent and heartwarming intimacy that you have with friends at that age, and you wanted that to last forever. And when you watch the TV show Friends, it did last forever. And I think for a lot of people, especially me, Matthew Perry's performance of Chandler was sort of the entryway to that. We're in a world where we're just getting nickeled and dimed by a lot of little stuff, like all the streaming services.
Oh, I refuse to give Apple money to access my own music. It's like, but don't you want to access your library on your phone? And I'm like, I fucking already paid for all this. Or took the chance of getting some horrible virus when I was in college, Like, this is my music. I'm not giving you $25 a year to access it.
Yeah. I just gave up on Apple as well.
I will live and die by this principle. It lets me access there's a couple like playlists I had made that transferred over, and then I actually bought 2 Taylor Swift albums that are, so it looks like I only listen to Taylor Swift, but that's because that's the only thing that's on my phone, because I bought it through Apple, so it's like, oh yeah, here you go, and I'm like, where's the rest of my stuff, guys? But it's fine. No, it's, well, and not even just nickel and dimes, but like podcasting has changed since we got into this. Like, it's not the same anymore. I'm kind of looking down that tunnel towards the end too, of like, unless you do this as a living, you can't do this anymore. And not that it's impossible, but...
Well, it's difficult because when I first listened to podcasts, it was very Wild West. And I remember the first show I listened to that I really liked was, of all things, the Adam Carolla program, because it was the most professional sounding podcast around at the time. And a lot of podcasts were just people meandering for 3 hours and with no structure, no budget. The worst example of it, or the prime example of it, is Kevin Smith. And I was a Kevin Smith fan, and I still appreciate what Kevin Smith has done. But he really got into podcasting. But I think he's a bad podcaster.
He has other talents. Kevin Smith is going to be fine.
Well, and you know what? He makes a lot. I think he does very well for himself as a podcaster, because people like to. If you're a fan of his, you're able to. And if you're able to survive his 3-hour meandering, I don't know if I haven't listened to it for a while. I don't think he's smokes as much marijuana as he used to, but he would just be stoned and giggly and go on and on and on. And his co-host would be his friends from high school who aren't very talented. So he didn't have a good person to bounce off of. And it was like, oh, this is going on forever. Carolla was, because he had a radio history, had intros and outros. He had segments. He had like guests. It was very structured. So you had all the advantages of talk radio, where a professional guy with a good radio voice who knows how to, the beats of an episode, but without the constraints of, and every hour on the 5s we'll do the traffic report, all that crap.
See, I think my problem is I got into it and it was very do-it-yourself. It was, obviously I wasn't making money off this, but got thrown a $10 here, a $10 there, and it wasn't very expensive, so it was fine. And the last time I went to upload a new show, it took like 5 days. And I was like, you used to be able to just hear by the time I fought, and I don't know. I feel like they expect that the person who is submitting, you know what it is? They expect that the person who makes the podcast is not the same person. They pay someone to sit there and submit their shows and do the graphic design and do all that. They don't expect that it's one person doing it anymore, which is what I learned to do. And I'm not paying someone to promote my show, and I'm not a celebrity doing a show based on...
Every celebrity has a show.
And that's it. It's all celebrities now. And they can pay someone to do the grunt work for them.
There was a podcast for a while called I forget now I'm completely blanking on the title, but it was Mark Paul Gosselaar, who played Zach Morris in Saved by the Bell, and he was doing a watch along because he said he had not many of the episodes of Saved by the Bell he never watched. He's one of these people. He's a performer who doesn't actually like watching themselves on screen. Him and a partner. Did you ever see the YouTube videos, Zach Morris is Trash?
I didn't. I remember when his podcast came out, hearing about this, but I wasn't into that.
His partner was this guy who did these series of videos where they would recap all the episodes of Saved by the Bell and talk about how Zach Morris was actually a terrible human being. And all credit to the guy, to Mark Paul Gosselaar, he got the joke, and they ended up becoming friendly, and they did this watch-along podcast. And they had good guests, because a lot of people who ended up having good careers had cameos or, whatever, or small roles or background on an episode here or there. I was only able, I listened to like a handful of episodes, and it was good, but I was like, I didn't actually like this show that much when I was a kid. But Mark Paul Gosselaar has been doing doing interviews for a new show that he has coming out, and they asked him about it because apparently the show ended before they got through all the episodes, and he revealed it's because they lost the network, the podcast network that was producing the show, either canceled the show or they went under or whatever, and they're looking. I was like, oh my god, you had a network? Like, it wasn't just he wanted to rewatch these episodes with somebody he likes. It was somebody was paying him money, and there was a professional studio behind it. I was like, oh my god, this isn't what it was.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we sound like the oldest people yelling, "Get off our lawn." I'm fully aware that I sound like a cranky old person. Back in my day, everyone edited their own audio.
You know what? I got 8 years out of this. I've done Cosmic Geppetto for 8 years. That's a long time. And if you would have told me 8 years ago when I was bored and I had infant children and I didn't have the time, and you know this very well. You're more intimately familiar with it right now than I am.
I just had to mute my microphone while my 5-year-old, who I was pregnant with during my first shows, came into the room. It's a trip.
I wasn't, I like making music. I like doing theater. I wasn't able to do those things. So I found podcasting was something I could do from home. And, if you had told me when I started this, I would still be doing it 8 years later. And the people I've got a chance to talk to and interview and meet, more than a win. But I just, and I've told this story. I was driving home. I dropped my son off at school every day, and I was driving back, and I just was like, I don't have a guest for this next podcast. Oh God, I'm gonna have to reach out, and I don't have anything that I'm really inspired by. And I just stopped. Like, why am I still doing this show? Because when it becomes a chore, or when you don't feel inspired by it anymore, and that's when I said it's like we're gonna end with episode 300, and that remotivated me because like, okay, this is my opportunity to get you back on, and have it like. I'm going to have Scott Corelli back on, like my favorite guest. I get one more round with them. It's having Jarf on. And this all started with me and Jarf. Jarf was my guest on the first regular episode, and he's been a regular contributor the whole time. Jarf has gone off on his own thing. And it was funny. We just posted an episode when this one comes out, where we used to do a recurring thing where we would find something in pulp culture that we think needs to be fixed, and then we would talk about what it needs to do to fix it. And we hadn't done that in years because Jarvis does his own thing, and and it's like, oh, I miss doing that, and it sort of inspires you to go back. And the kids are older. I have I'm doing theater again, and also I'm doing music again. And in mid-November, my band is playing a gig, and it's fun. It's a different thing, and trying to put a new effort into that.
But we got to go out on a high note, so obviously, would you like to talk about what we said we'd be here to talk about today?
Well, first, we've been talking for about 20 minutes. I haven't even introduced you yet. Returning to the podcast, and it's been a while.
It really has.
Tierne Steele, One Steele Sister. That's still your handle, right?
That's me. Yep. Still got that website, onesteelsister.com, with the links to my many shows and my many guest appearances and my book. When we started this, I was working in a library and to just gotten married and thinking, maybe I'll have a kid, and now I'm a published author with a 5-year-old who won't go to bed. So sorry if that's being picked up on the audio. I'm still going. I'm on the hook for another podcast show. At least one more round for me. So we'll see.
Not that long ago in the news, and this was a movie that especially has some resonance in Baltimore. There was some talk about Michael Oher, who was the subject of the movie Blindside, which won Sandra Bullock an Oscar for her portrayal.
And it was nominated Best Picture, wasn't it?
I think you're right.
I just was talking about, like, Oscar, movies that won that shouldn't have, and I'm pretty sure Blindside was on the list of nominees.
Yeah, it was, and I don't know. Have you ever watched The Blind Side?
I have. So yeah, audience, we're painting a picture of a well-regarded motion picture.
Oscars have a weird thing where they nominate something and sometimes they become surprisingly dated, but even with Blindside, and I watched the movie, I liked it well enough. And I live outside of Baltimore, and Baltimore people liked it a lot because Michael Oher got drafted the movie was about him. He was a high school, college football player who was taken in by an affluent Southern white family, and they made him a member of his family, and he became a great football player who got drafted in the first round by the Baltimore Ravens.
Boom, Baltimore connection.
I actually got to meet's too strong a term, but Michael Oher, who put out his own book after the movie came out, did a book signing at a bookstore a little north of Baltimore, and we went and we got his autograph, and he was very nice. My oldest, was very young at the time, and he like high-fived Chase, and he's like, "Oh, what a cute kid," and he was very nice. Even then, watching the movie, I was like, can't believe this isn't considered an Oscar-worthy movie. Sandra Bullock was very good in it, but how do I put this? It seemed like and there's a lot of Oscar awards given out like this, it seemed like a career achievement Oscar, where Sandra Bullock has been very good. She's very well liked in the industry, and she did a movie that was good enough and it was serious enough where they gave her an Oscar.
I was just going to say, because I did not see The Blind Side in theaters. I knew it existed. I knew what it was about. And it just did not capture my attention, whatever. New England Yankee, what do I care? And then it was getting the Oscar buzz. And so I did eventually watch it once it came out on TV. I think it was probably HBO, and like I had HBO that year for some reason or something. But whatever, it was on. I watched it, and I remember pretty soon after the movie came out, and having been a person who was interested in film, had studied film, there was a little bit of that, like, is this a feel-good stuff? Like, this is kind of weird that she just, like, takes this kid. But, it's the feel-good. Like, no, she uplifts him, and he made it. He's a Baltimore Raven, blah, blah, blah. I also had just this little bit of icky feeling because I feel like I watched it right around when New York City especially, or maybe this was a national thing, was talking about problem. I guess it depends on what side you're on. Maybe some people don't see this as a problem of religious schools. Like if you have charter money, can your school be, like if it's not a public school, can you do prayer and stuff? And in this film, they attend not a Catholic school. Because I knew Catholic schools. Catholic schools always existed. There were always a Catholic school running around. But where I grew up in New England, there were not other Christian but not Catholic separate schools. Why would you need a separate school for that? You just went to regular school. And again, this is 100% my own bias. I'm a white lady. I'm from Connecticut. It's not a broad worldview that I brought to the table. But when they show in the movie, like, oh yeah, and they go to the school, and I realized it was like, oh my God, those are the schools that they've been talking about, where it's like religious school, but not Catholic, and my little brain was just starting to like know that was a thing. So now that I've revealed my incredible ignorance of the world, but that was my even when I first watched this movie, I had that little tingle in the back of my brain of like, I don't know, this is kind of creepy, right? And when did Peyton Manning do the skit on SNL making fun of The Blind Side? I should have looked that up as part of my research.
I think a lot of people knew it was sort of dicey at the time. I remember there was a lot. My memory of when the movie came out, it did well financially. Sandra Bullock got good press for it. Like, people appreciated the acting, but a lot of people said at the time it just felt like a Hallmark movie with a better cast and a little bit better budget. It didn't look bad, but it didn't look great.
And I can't think of the term, the saviorism term, that it was just like,
a white savior.
I was like, because I remember people talking about like, aren't there other stories we could be telling than this one? But it was a real story, so obviously it got a pass, right?
Right. And listen, Michael Orr, I heard him on the radio all the time. I saw him on TV, met the guy, ever so briefly met the guy. We bought his book, I read his book. He was always irritated by, he always expressed frustration the way he was presented in that movie. Because the movie literally had this big, athletic guy who didn't really care about football, didn't understand football, who had this preteen teaching him football in the living room because Michael Orr didn't know football, but the kid did. And Michael Orr said how, no, he always had a passion for sport. You don't get that good just because you have physical abilities. You don't become a world-class athlete without having a passion for the game and drive. Also, another funny thing, Michael Orr, and this was brought up when people would interview him, was the first case of them doing a movie about someone, and the real-life version is actually better looking, better shape, more charismatic than the movie version. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because it caused a lot of controversy because Michael Orr ended up suing that the family that quote-unquote adopted him. It turns out they didn't adopt him. They put him on a conservatorship, which has been in the news in the last couple of years because of Britney Spears being under a conservatorship. And he is claiming that they made a lot of money off his life story more than he did. And it was his life story. There are a lot of cases of that, of these biopics based on a true story, and it turns out it's sort of crap. It's sort of interesting how we should feel about that. And you know, when I broached this with you, I knew you would bring the goods on it. Like, can you think of some biopics that you've really enjoyed, but you knew deep down it's like, well, this is sort of crap?
I actually have probably my favorite, but I'm trying to think. I'm like running through my head. I think of the straight up biopics, my absolutely favorite one, and it has a counter example and an example of this. I love the film Rudy. I don't care. I like Notre Dame, fighting Irish all the way. My grandfather went to Notre Dame for undergrad. He's from Indiana. And I love the movie Rudy. I don't care how schmaltzy it is. Victory, victory, that's our cry. V-I-T. Okay, anyway. I won't start quoting from the movie or we'll be here all night. And I remember that moment when it's like, perhaps Daniel E. Rudiger is not Sean Astin in this movie. But it also contains my favorite counterexample, which is, you don't often hear about this, someone who was portrayed worse in a movie than in real life. Would you like to know?
Well, I know with Rudy, I know the coach who is presented as the bad guy.
Dan Devine! Dan Devine had no problem with Rudy playing. It was like his idea. I mean, not his idea. It was, but like, so Disney, let's face it, went to him and said, basically, we need a bad guy for our film. Like, do you mind if we make you the bad guy? And he signed off and said, yeah, that's, you know, they present as like, we need to have some conflict. We're going to have it that you don't have him on the list or something so that the players will advocate for him. And so he said, yeah, that's fine. And then after he saw the movie, he's like, oh my God, like people were coming up and like yelling at him in the street. And he's like, I didn't do that.
It's hilarious because the poor guy who was apparently such a big supporter of Rudy, and And he gets played by one of these all-time great Weasley actors who you just want to punch in the face whenever you see him.
Some people make wonderful careers out of being that guy, but yes.
Yes, was it another actor like that, Stephen Tobolowsky, who loves going on podcasts and comes across as the sweetest human being on the planet. But, Bill Murray punched him in Groundhog's Day and everyone cheered. That type of actor.
You call me rich cause I'm clean and I'm wealthy. Sitting in the kitchen with your friend in the deli. Hey, walking down the street looking deadly. Pouring up the sauce coming family. You know you got the envy. Getting up the snack at the pantry. With the clean peas on the brandy. Looking all fancy.
I mentioned another football movie where Vinny Papale, who was a player for the Philadelphia Eagles, and I'm a lifelong Philadelphia fan, and they turned his story into the movie Invincible, starring Mark Wahlberg. But they turned it into the movie Invincible, which is a movie I liked very much. But in the movie, the Philadelphia Eagles held open tryouts where any fan could try out for the Eagles, and Papale, who never, they sort of imply that all the football he played was just in rainy backlots with his buddies, and he was able to make the team, and the owner didn't want him on the team, but the coach did. Well, it turns out that was crap. Vinny Papale, he had some college football experience, and then he tried out for he did do a walk-on tryout for a minor league football team based in Philadelphia area, but that's sort of what everyone did. Most towns have an independent league football team or baseball team or whatever that any schmuck off the street can apply because that's how they get their talent. So he played for that team, excelled, and then got given a chance by the Eagles, not because he was a plucky, not because it was a heartwarming story, but because, he was a pretty good football player, and football teams need 50-plus people to play. And the end of the movie, and it's a very good movie, Papale is plucky and tough, and he ends up this amazing play where it's a punt, and he's able to get a jump on it, and he knocks the other player, and the ball gets loose, and it's this 10-yard run, and he grabs it, and he's chased half the field. It makes the field look like it's 2 miles long. And then at the end of the movie, they show the actual play. It's he hit a guy and he picked up the ball real quick and he was 2 yards away from a touchdown. And it wasn't nearly as It wasn't nearly as cinematic. There was no slow motion.
I think most movies that I thought of when you mentioned this, it's okay, things are for the movie. Things are done for the movie. And there's lots of I went to college at a time where I could have told you any of the songs from the films Center Stage and Coyote Ugly. Now, are those based on real stories? Kind of. They're not biopics, though. But there's just, every time I see a movie, I have that suspension of disbelief. It's like the 40s movies and 50s movies. Yeah, I'm sure there were people who grew roses and were local heroes in England during World War II, but Mrs. Minerva isn't real. Jimmy Stewart is not a real person. And I think that's the difference with something like The Blind Side, with something like Dan Devine. These are real people who could stand up and be yeah, that's what it was like, or no, that's not what it was like. And I think a lot of the icky feelings come from, was Michael Oher mine? When, in the conservatorship and stuff like that. I just said that word wrong too. You don't realize how hard that word is to say until you have to do it.
It's too similar to other words, and it's got a lot of syllables. You're gonna.
Which I want to throw out there. There is a podcast, not so much related to biopics, but I think is a very important podcast, and it's by a former celebrity. So I am a hypocrite from what I said at the top of the show. Dear Hollywood, which is a podcast by Allison Stoner, who is a dancer and actress as a child, is about child star and and what stardom does to a kid. Like, not just the salacious, but like, what does it do to their brain? Like, how do you develop differently if this is the world you grow up in? And it is fascinating and sad and a great listen. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a little plug, because I think Dear Hollywood is a really important show.
And I just subscribed to that podcast because that sounds really fascinating. The thing with, these based on the true stories, sometimes I don't, like, in the case of Rudy, Rudy makes you feel a little uncomfortable because, a guy who was actually a legit good guy and a supporter of Rudy becomes the bad guy, and people, like, confuse things.
Well, and Rudy is very, again, it's not the real story, but it is punched up for that stuff with his dad was not a factor, like, and then he went on to, like, have this, like, the fraud thing. And so it's just like, okay, this is not, like, some idea. Like, people are human. I think that's what a big part of Dear Hollywood is telling me. Is like, people are human, and they're messy, and they're complicated.
Yeah, it's fine in general. It's like, okay, you're taking a story and you're punching it up, and you gotta, take big messy lives and put it into an hour and a half, 2 hour. I get that.
We Are Marshall. I'm sure stuff in We Are Marshall is Hollywooded up, but I don't care. I still love that movie.
Where it makes me feel a little queasy is another movie I liked. And I know a lot of people like this movie, and I think it also got some Oscar consideration. Greatest Showman. Hugh Jackman kicking ass. Yeah, and Hugh Jackman, it is funny because we think of, the general public thinks of Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, and Wolverine couldn't be any less, and he's a very good Wolverine, but it's a role that makes the least use of Hugh Jackman's talents. Because Hugh Jackman is a great singing, dancing guy, with a wonderful charisma and likability, and the Greatest Showman took full advantage of that. And it's about P.T. Barnum, who was a garbage human being. He wasn't a charming, likable guy who was giving people a chance to let their light shine. He like owned people. He bought people.
And it's funny because somewhere in an alternate universe, there is a realistic version of The Greatest Showman. And it is also an amazing movie that got Oscar consideration.
Yeah, but instead of Hugh Jackman being charming and singing, it's Willem Dafoe, like everyone rooting for him to die of syphilis at the end of the movie. It's tough because then you have that. It's like, so my kids are, kids watching and singing. It's like, I want to be like P.T. Barnum. It's like, I'd kick you out of the house. And this is not a new thing. Heck, what was it? Mutiny on the Bounty, which isn't a story that really gets told anymore, but there were a bunch of movie versions of that. And about Mr. Christian and Captain Bligh, and in most of the tellings, Mr. Christian was a good, upstanding man who fell in love with a woman on an island they visited, and the evil Captain Bligh wouldn't allow them to, wouldn't forbade their love, and was a cruel taskmaster. That's a story that happened because in the real world, Captain Bligh was, was out to sea, and then the people who committed a mutiny against him, they went to trial, and then they went to newspapers, and they ended up controlling the narrative. And for like hundreds of years, this story, which is completely BS, no, it was a bunch of guys who were basically sexually assaulting local island girls and getting chlamydia at the time. And then they decided we're going to like set their captain and a few other crew member out to sea to die. And then Captain Bligh was an amazing navigator and ended up surviving, and is considered to be one of the 2 or 3 greatest nautical feats of all time because they were able to survive and they didn't resort to cannibalism. But it's a BS story that's been told for so long, and all of a sudden it becomes a narrative. And again, it's not something that's really touched upon too much anymore. For whatever reason, that's a story that just ran out of steam 30 years ago. There was actually a movie. The last time it was a movie version with Mel Gibson playing Mr. Christian and Anthony Hopkins playing the captain. And this is like 25 to 30-year-old Mel Gibson when he was at his most charming, his most likable, and we didn't know what we know now.
Oh, did you ever watch? One of my favorite things that ever came about because of the inaccuracies in Braveheart. Did you ever watch a show on the History Channel called Reel to Reel? REAL to REEL. And it was historians talking about historical movies. And one of my absolute favorite things that I've ever seen in my life that is imprinted on my memory is a woman, definitely some sort of British, maybe Scottish, maybe not, but definitely somewhere from the British Isles, with short brown hair, and she's laughing so hard that like tears are coming down her cheeks, and she finally manages to get out, "He'd been dead for 7 years," in reaction to the idea that it was Robert the Bruce's father was like part of the plot. Part of the plotting, and she's like, "He'd been dead for 7 years," and it just, all right, Reel to Reel is great. The other one I wanted to bring up, I'm sorry, I'm really bad at coming up with examples of actual movies, but things around this topic, apparently I'm great at finding, because I have another reference for you. If you have not seen the Bob's Burger episode Topsy, you should absolutely do that. It is, let's see, where is it? Season 3, episode 16. At Bob's Burgers, which is an animated cartoon on Fox for people who've been living under a rock. It is the science fair at Wagstaff School, and Louise wants to use the same volcano she made last year, but her substitute teacher, Thomas Edison impersonator Mr. Dinkler, with a strict no volcanoes rule, demands she make a project about Edison himself instead. After a tip-off by the school's librarian, she discovers Electrocuting an Elephant, the 1903 film shot by the Edison Studios, The Electrocution of Topsy the Elephant. Louise decides to recreate the electrocution despite Mr. Dinkler, with Tina playing Topsy and Gene as Edison, a role he accepts only after Louise allows him to write a musical number for it.
Oh my god, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. Questionable person.
I hate to sound like a jaded old person, but I just assume everyone is actually a jerk in real life, unless proven otherwise. Like, once you're past 30, you just kind of assume that everyone has good and bad in them.
Right. Yeah. You get a little. You end up being burned too many times by your heroes.
Yeah. What was it? Jerry Porter, who plays drums, he lives in LA, and he's a musician, so he gets to meet all people, and he's like, yeah, he doesn't get very starry-eyed, and he was talking about Miles Davis, and he goes, never read about your heroes, folks. You didn't even have to meet him, just reading the book was bad enough.
Yeah, I did a lot. I have done theater forever, and I took plenty of acting and theater classes, and I also took a Tennessee Williams class. And you end up getting subjected to a lot of the work of Marlon Brando because Brando starred in famously Streetcar Named Desire, which he gave a brilliant performance, and then he did another movie called Fugitive Kind. And you don't read about Brando. He was, and a lot of people listening to this, their view of Brando will be late stage.
They're thinking
Brando.
of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
Shout out to the Apocalypse Now Minutes podcast.
But some people they're not even thinking of those because Brando, for the last part of his life, he was just a heavy-set, weird guy who was, came across kind of creepy in interviews if you saw him. And then you find out he was belligerent, egotistical, and lazy. There are great, you mentioned The Godfather. There are still shots on the set of Robert Duvall wearing basically a piece of cardboard taped to his chest with Marlon Brando's lines in that movie. Because Brando could not be bothered to learn his lines. And apparently he would have people write, he would write lines on people's foreheads so he would look like he's looking at it when he's actually reading the lines off their forehead.
Doing these movies by minute podcasts, and especially doing one about, because I did one about Apocalypse Now, and I read, Eleanor Coppola's notes, and, again, but I was already at that point of sometimes people were jerks, but sometimes they weren't, and I really, it makes me appreciate more knowing that, I love George Lucas. I wanted to be George Lucas for most of my life. I'm kind of Team Marsha when it comes down to it. She cheated on him, but he wrote her out of the Star Wars story. And that does not sit well with me. Knowing everything that I've read doing American Graffiti and everything, it's just you can be mad, but you don't get to pretend that this person doesn't exist for everyone. But it makes me appreciate more. And again, he'd be the first one to say he's not a perfect person. Steven Spielberg seems like a decent guy. Did some drugs, but didn't have it. All these people, it's it makes you appreciate the ones where it's yeah, they had their problems, but overall, a decent person. And the other place I run into this freaking all the time is I'm a big follower of baseball. Several of my shows have touched on that. Do you know how hard it is to pick out a favorite baseball player who wasn't a jerk? It's real hard. It's real hard. I grew up a Phillies fan, so 3 of my favorite Phillies during their playing career, Pete Rose, that went downhill. Curt Schilling. Oh, yep.
I was such a Curt Schilling fan, aside from the fact that he was a really good player. I remember every year, one of the local sports talk stations, WIP, would have a fundraiser. And Curt Schilling was one of the few Phillies. There were some, they would have signed bats and, VIP tickets and stuff. Curt Schilling, in conjunction with this radio station, had for a fundraiser, you could bid to have dinner at Curt Schilling's house. You would go to his house, he and his wife would cook you dinner, and you would get to hang out with him. And I thought that was the coolest, most fan-friendly thing I ever heard. And I was like, well, now I'm a Curt Schilling fan. And then everything else happened.
Oh, my sweet summer child. Yep.
Now, in fairness, that is a legit cool thing he did.
Oh, yeah.
But damn. That's tough. And then Lenny Dykstra. Lenny Dykstra center fielder for the Phillies for their magical 93 season. And he is a shifty, fraudulent, and has been accused of some sexual impropriety. I'm going to just put a big fat allegedly on all that because I don't want to get sued. But, you know, it's tough. It's very difficult, but you wish for the best, and often, and you hope they're good people, and often you get fooled by what is presented, and it's like, oh, they're upstanding people, and then it's like, not so much.
I have always appreciated the first person that I heard say, God, Ted Williams could be a jerk, was Ted Williams. It's just like, wow, I was an asshole. And it's like, how refreshing, you know? Like, it was so lovely to watch someone. I think he must have been in his, like, probably late 40s or 50s when this interview that I was watching was filmed. But it was just like, now that is like, you can look back on your past and realize that you were a grade A jerk and you're not denying it. And that's where I really lose my mind, because with all the, like, things coming out about Hollywood and history and stuff, I have, and maybe this is because of part of my jaded, I kind of assume that there are creeps everywhere. And when I really lose my mind is when they are encouraged. Because here's the thing. We have an imperfect but functioning judicial system with laws to deal with creeps who commit crimes. But when they are priests that end up in Spotlight, or producers who end up running movie studios, or freaking Joss Whedon, anywhere in there, and I think that's why, like, George Lucas writing Marshall Lucas out of the story, it doesn't sit well. It's like, you have the power to make this go away, to not face any consequences for what you've done. And, like, obviously the problem is the thing you did that you need to face consequences for. And now I'm not talking about George Lucas, for the record. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about people who crossed lines and have now committed crimes, but they face no consequences for them. And it's just like, you know, yeah, that thing you did would be bad anywhere, but it is worse because you are in this protected institution. That's what really grinds my gears. You know,
obviously the probably most prominent recent example, speaking of producers, Harvey Weinstein.
I just rewatched Scream. Love Scream.
Well, I mentioned before Kevin Smith. Kevin Smith would not have had a career if it wasn't for Harvey Weinstein throwing his support and money behind Kevin Smith's early films. Weinstein didn't have to be such crap. He was rich. He had an outrageous amount of fame for an executive producer in a movie studio. You don't really know. That's not somebody who you know who they are. Yeah. But because he had a big personality and he was politically involved, and him and his brother sort of had an interesting story because they created Miramax, which was the name of their parents put together, and they put a lot of money behind smaller movies and were able to sort of will them into success. His involvement with their ability to spot talent like Kevin Smith, like Quentin Tarantino. And listen, he was a really rich guy. And had a beautiful wife, and famous friends, and got to hang out with glamorous people, despite the fact that he was an ugly, pockmarked guy who wasn't very talented at anything other than producing movies. Like, he wrote a script and it was terrible. They actually, like, hands-on worked on movies, I think, as a director, and it bombed. But they were able to, you know, he had this charmed life, But no, it's not enough to have a charmed life and a beautiful wife. And, you know, and Kevin Smith talked about it. It's like, listen, I just thought he was cheating on his wife. That wasn't it. It wasn't, like, even that wouldn't have been enough. He could have had a girlfriend on the side and nobody would have cared. No, he had to force women against their will, and then if anyone dared talk back to him, he destroyed careers. Mira Sorvino should be an A-list actress based on her looks, talent, her family history, but because she dared turn down, she was an Oscar-winning actress that dared turn down the advances of Harvey Weinstein, and he did his best and was pretty successful in gutting her career. Surprise, surprise, Harvey Weinstein ends up being a little bit of a trigger for me.
You are watching a master at work.
It's on us to sort out where we fall ethically on these things. I think part of what's so frustrating, and again, you know, compared to a lot of people, we live charmed lives, but we have to sit here and decide where every single person now has to decide, for every single creative, it feels like, where is my line for this person? What's the worst thing they could do where I would still, you know, like, because some of these people have created IP that changed our lives. And it's sometimes hard to walk away from. Sometimes it's not. I can tell you that up until the latest round of decluttering, I owned, well, no, the book had already gone. The book had gone, but this last round of decluttering, we got rid of we still had the DVD of Bill Cosby's himself. One of the funniest, like, my sister and I had that memorized. And I was like, the money's been spent. You know, the money on this DVD was spent in, 2000, whatever it was.
I think that came out in the 80s.
It came out in the 80s. My sister and I knew it growing up. We had it taped off the TV, and then eventually we got the DVD to replace that. And because it was quoted, it was one of the few, when my sister and I we got to the age where we were dating people, we had said, like, what are the movies that someone has to see to understand our family? The original Arthur with Dudley Moore, The Five Pennies, or Danny Kaye, Bill Cosby's himself, and bonus if they know who Victor Borge is.
Oh God, Victor Borge is wonderful.
If you watch Victor Borge, The Five Pennies, Arthur, and Bill Cosby's himself, you get hanged because we were going to quote it constantly out of context. And if you didn't know what we were quoting, you would be very confused. But
that was perfect Bill Cosby, because before that, he told some jokes. It's pretty famous and it's been revisited, his Spanish fly joke, where he's talking about him and his buddies going to Tijuana to get Spanish fly because they said if you would give a girl Spanish fly, it would knock her out. In retrospect, we realized, like, oh my God, he was telling on himself then. So before Bill Cosby himself, he had that, like, sometimes his going into his history with growing up would touch on that creepy stuff. And then after Bill Cosby himself, his comedy revolved a lot about him just talking a lot of shit about his wife.
Yeah. And
Bill Cosby himself was the one where he was a dad, and he would joke about his marriage and her giving birth and all that, but it wasn't mean.
Yeah. It wasn't, it didn't have that mean factor.
Bill Cosby himself, it was like a year or two, basically that inspired them to do the Cosby Show. And Cosby Show, you don't see it anymore. I think you got to do a deep dive to find it playing anywhere, but that was the biggest show on the planet. Everyone watched that.
it is going to be so hard for future generations to grasp it. Like, it's not going to compute to them. And we didn't know. Obviously, a lot of people did, but we sitting at home certainly did not.
He was America's dad. And it was a groundbreaking show because it was an affluent black family.
Lawyer and a doctor. And then, and so I know a lot of people, when that finally came out, got rid of everything. And I self-justified, and I was like, the money's been spent. That is how I justified it to myself. And I'm 100% using that word. Like, I was in the wrong, but I loved this one piece of work that he'd done so much that I made an excuse to hold on to it. And now I tell myself, like, look, it's still in my head. Like, my sister and I are going to be 75 years old, and if someone gives us 50 cents, we're going to turn to it and say, for 50 cents, there never was happiness. And, like, I'm sorry, that's in my brain. I think he should be in jail, but
oh yeah,
it's awful that we have to play this game. It's so yucky to say that, but it's not a game, but like, you have to find that line, and you have to find it over and over and over again. If a white lady found a black guy who was good at football and said, hey, come live with me and I'll help you get access to more training, doesn't matter how old he is, doesn't matter what his living situation is. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can't just have that suspension of disbelief and sit there and enjoy a movie for the sake of that movie. Now your brain is constantly calculating, where does this start to feel icky? Where does this start to feel like a crime? And that's not an enjoyable way to spend a couple hours.
In music, this happens all the time because musicians are a famously broken lot. You know, there's R. Kelly fans out there, and jeez.
Again, another thing that is in my head. How do I unlearn Ignition Remix? There's no way. It's just there in my brain, making me feel guilty.
I'm a big fan of the musician Ryan Adams. He was the lead singer for Whiskey Town and had a nice little under-the-radar alt-country career. Some of his... he wrote the song Stars Go Blue that was became a pretty big hit for Tim McGraw. And he was known for being difficult. And then he was married to Mandy Moore, and he dated and produced music for... she's in Boy Genius. She had the song... she had the song... yes, I am completely blanking on her. Phoebe Bridgers, who has gotten a bit of, is sort of a buzzy performer. She was a music guest on SNL. She hangs out with Taylor Swift. She's, sort of an indie darling. And just a lot of, and then a lot of accusations came out, and a lot of women accusing him of sliding into their him sliding into their DMs and hanging out with, and some of these girls, not necessarily significantly. He's in his 40s, getting probably close to his 50s, and women in their 20s, if not younger, and people posting on their TikTok or their Instagram, them singing or playing music, and him's like, "Hey, you want to come over?" It's just as bad as it sounds. "Hey, do you want to come over to our studio? I think you got a great sound." That girls don't. Just don't. And it's tough because it's one of my favorite musicians, and best case scenario, he's a jackass. That's the most you can hope for, is he's a jackass, and it gets so much worse from there.
I do appreciate, and I can't think of any, I don't want to say any examples off the top of my head because I don't know them well enough. I appreciate when there is an accusation that a line was crossed. Not necessarily that a crime was committed, but that a line was crossed. And let's face it, the male accused goes, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea that's how, like, I just thought that was a date that ended badly or something." You know, like that.
Aziz Ansari.
Yes. Okay, good. Because that was one of the people that I was like, I don't want to, I don't remember details, and this is several years ago. But someone who, when confronted, goes, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I did not mean that to come off that way." Not like, "Oh, I'm sorry you took it that way," but like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. That was not my intention," And because we now live in a world where we realize it's not always black and white of, was this a crime or not? And so I will always appreciate someone who, or if there were a musician in his late 40s that DM'd a girl in her 20s saying, "I think you have a great sound, you should come into the studio," and when confronted said, "Oh my God, no, I really just wanted you to come into the studio." Like, that would be fine.
But it's never what happens.
And the thing is, I have friends who will not accept that. They're like, "Nope, the fact that it crossed a line at all doesn't matter that they didn't mean to." And I have friends, and we have disagreed on some people with that, who would say, like, "No, they should know better." And it's like, I'm willing to give people a little bit more humanity.
Well, yeah, with Aziz Ansari, it was, and boy, that controversy was, it was sad because you like him, but it was tough because the woman who, and accusation isn't even, I think might even be too strong a term. She was just recounting that she had a pretty crappy date with him and felt uncomfortable. But she wasn't accusing him of anything specifically.
But the timing in which this happened, the world accused him. Like, on her behalf.
And then she got some backlash. And none of which was fair because, again, she wasn't saying, "I want him arrested, I want him canceled." She was just saying, "Yeah, I had a pretty crappy date. He was a little too insistent."
Bit handsy.
Yeah. And I think every woman probably has a story like that of the guy who she invited back to her place and she was thinking ABC might happen, and he was hoping that XYZ would happen, and pushed a little too much. And he wasn't a bad guy, but no thanks. And not only, and often that would be enough to ruin it, so there would be no next date. Every guy probably has that story of when they were this, thought, quote unquote, thought they had a shot and tried a little too hard, and then realized the next day, he's like, "Yep, I pressed too hard, and now she will not answer my calls." And that doesn't make us...
There's a great example of that, to a lesser extent, because it's about teenagers, in Tom Taylor's book, In Memory of Todd Woods. And I won't say details, because it's very towards the end of the book, so I don't want to spoil it. But someone who has been spending the entire book being like, "Oh, the jocks, they suck. They're all so awful to their girlfriends." And he gets a little handsy, a little assistant. And the girl is just like, "What makes you different than the jocks that you say are so awful? Like, you're doing the exact same thing, basically." And there are other examples, but that was the one that, like, sprung, because it was litigated in the press for, like, 6 months of our lives. But there have been other examples of guys who, once an allegation is made, like, you can just tell are, like, not trying to cover it up, not trying to silence the person, not trying to, like, deny what happened, just like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And it's like, yay, you get it. And I think that it's the unrepentantness of some of these people.
Well, Tierney, it's been awesome having you on.
I was desperately trying to pull us around to a happy place to end on. I was looking at the timer being like, is this where we're going to end? Ugh.
No, what we're going to bring to the happy place is you have a book out, and you have podcasts coming up, and I need you to plug your pluggables.
I do. I have a book out, and no one is awful in it. People are human, and there are people you can root against. And my editor at one point was literally like, how old is this guy supposed to be? He's sitting on a high school. And I'm like, yes, because that's what college boys do, because they're gross. And I left it in. So if you would like to read about, it's basically a American graffiti, but set in the late 90s. Actually, August 2000. It's called The Post Road. It's by Tierne Steele. That's me. There's links to it on my website, onesteelsister.com. And that also has links to my shows. I'm supposed to be doing Dirty Dancing with Rachel Mummer and Doris Weiss. We're going to do Dirty Dancing one song at a time. I'm going to keep saying it and like manifest it out into the universe because it just hasn't happened. Everyone has been busy and certain co-hosts have gone back to school and other co-hosts live in Germany with a very big time difference. And it just hasn't come together. So I really want to do that. It will. That is another podcast that will talk about some very, very serious things, but also have a lot of fun and just really revel in the fun part of the stuff too. Like, we are going to dance and we are going to advocate for reproductive rights at the same time.
I remember when that movie came out, and it was so influential culturally, and that movie single-handedly like revitalized oldies radio stations. Like all of a sudden, the most popular radio station in every town became the oldie station because of how much people loved the music. And what was hilarious is that movie ends with them playing, Time of Your Life, which does not match the sound of the era at all. It is a fine song, and people love that song. It does not belong in that movie even a little bit.
The sound, no, but that is also the movie that has Hungry Eyes and She's Like the Wind. The soundtrack is 80s-tastic with like 2 or 3 60 songs thrown in for flavor.
She's Like the Wind, as sung by Patrick Swayze.
Yep. Oh, I can't wait to talk about it. Oh, it's going to be fun. But I do have completed projects in case that takes a while to come to fruition. So I mentioned I've done the Apocalypse Now minutes. With Chris Frey and I also did a podcast called This Means Something, which was about Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I've done Joe versus the Volcano with Jarf. That was actually the first time that I said I was retired from podcasting. And then Jarf was like, I'm going to do Joe versus the Volcano. And it was very, you son of a bitch, I'm in. So, yeah. And then if you listen to the Never Ending Minute about the Never Ending Story, our last episode was a bonus. We actually got to interview Tammy Stronach, who played the childlike empress in that movie. And it was the day before my due date.
Oh, wow.
I mentioned I was pregnant while doing that show, and the timing had gotten messed up, and, we got pushed back, then she got pushed back, and so we finally had a day, and it was the day before my due date. So I have very fond memories of sitting, waddling over to a chair and putting the microphone between so I could record.
Tierney, we recommend everyone check it out. Tierney, thank you so much for doing this. This has been great, and it's always a joy. Thank you so much for you've been a wonderful part of my podcasting journey. And I'm glad we could do this one more time.
Thank you for letting me come on one more time and randomly explore my feelings about pop culture. Wherever dark place that took us to this time.
That wraps episode 291. Big thanks to Tierne Steele. She is a longtime favorite, and she proved why. Glad we got her back one more time. Coming soon to the Cosmic Geppetto podcast, he's one of the best. Scott Corelli returns. Till then, in the words of Jarf Hardin.
See you in the funny pages.
Subscribe to the Cosmic Geppetto podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever quality podcasts can be found. Rate and review us while there. Follow us on Twitter at CosmicGPod and we will follow you back. Unless you're a jerk. We don't follow jerks. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cosmic Geppetto. We love hearing your ideas for upcoming episodes. Email us at cosmicgeppetto@comcast.net.
Girls, don't. Just don't.